Pamela Anderson sits in front of the camera, her blonde hair pulled back, her voice measured, her face calm yet shadowed by memory. At 58 years old, she has lived many lives in one. She has been the most photographed woman in the world, the dream of an entire generation, the actress who ran across television screens in slow motion, the glamorous centerfold who redefined beauty for the 1990s. And yet, when she speaks of her marriage to Tommy Lee, there is no sparkle in her eyes, only a heaviness that tells a story of love and devastation entwined. In her recent documentary, she doesn't shy away from calling it what it was. "He was the love of my life," she says, pausing as if the words are both a comfort and a curse. Then, just as firmly, she admits, but it was also a nightmare. That contradiction has fascinated the public for decades. Their romance was a storm, intoxicating, passionate, explosive. It started like something out of a movie, a chance meeting, a whirlwind courtship, a beachside wedding after just 4 days. The world was entranced. The golden girl of television and the tattooed bad boy of rock seemed like opposites destined to collide, and they did, hard. For a moment, it looked like they had found their perfect match. They were young, reckless, madly in love, and for a short while, unstoppable. But fairy tales are not built for the real world, and theirs came crashing down under the weight of fame, betrayal, and violence. This story is not simply about romance gone wrong. It is about how two people, under the unforgiving glare of cameras and the suffocating pressure of celebrity culture, became symbols of both passion and tragedy. Together, they lived through one of the most scandalous moments in entertainment history when their stolen private tape was leaked to the world, changing not just their lives, but the way the public consumed celebrity privacy forever. They endured courtroom battles, public humiliation, and tabloid cruelty. Behind closed doors, they faced addiction, jealousy, and rage. And when it all ended, what was left was not just heartbreak, but scars that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Now, as Pamela looks back, her words cut through decades of gossip and speculation. There is no more performance, no need to sugarcoat what the world already suspects. She tells the truth, that Tommy Lee was the only man she ever truly loved, and that love, instead of saving her, nearly destroyed her. It is a story of contradictions, tenderness and violence, intimacy and betrayal, love and fear. And it is a story that asks the question, how did Hollywood's most glamorous couple, once idolized by millions, become one of its darkest cautionary tales? This is not just the story of Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee. It is the story of love at its most blinding, fame at its most unforgiving, and how even the brightest spotlight can cast the darkest shadows. She was born Pamela Denise Anderson in the small town of Ladysmith, British Columbia, a place that couldn't have been further from the Hollywood lights that would one day define her. The daughter of a furnace repairman and a waitress, Pamela grew up with no illusions of stardom. Her childhood was marked by the ordinary routines of a working-class family, surrounded by forests, ocean views, and the quiet rhythms of island life. But beneath the simplicity, Pamela carried wounds that would shape her sensitivity forever. She has since spoken openly about the trauma she endured in her youth, including abuse that left her feeling vulnerable and unprotected long before the cameras ever found her. It was a pain she buried deep inside, masking it with an innocent smile and a natural beauty that seemed to glow without effort. Her path to fame was as unlikely as it was sudden. In 1989, Pamela attended a Canadian football game where her life changed in an instant. Shown on the stadium's jumbotron wearing a Labatt's Blue Beer t-shirt, the crowd went wild, cheering for the stunning young woman who seemed to radiate star quality. That brief moment of chance exposure turned into an opportunity. Labatt signed her for a modeling campaign, and her image, once unknown, began to circulate across Canada. Shortly after, she was invited to Los Angeles to pose for Playboy magazine. Pamela hesitated, unsure if this world was truly for her, but curiosity and ambition pulled her forward. She took the leap, and it catapulted her into history. Her first appearance in Playboy was in 1989, and by February 1990, she was named Playmate of the Month. The camera adored her, and so did audiences. She would go on to grace the magazine's cover more times than any other woman in history. For Pamela, Playboy was not just a career break. It was a doorway into a new life, one that brought both opportunity and danger. She was suddenly surrounded by powerful men, a glamorous lifestyle, and the kind of offers that seemed too good to be true. She embraced the excitement. But beneath the surface, she carried the insecurities of a small-town girl who often felt she didn't belong. Her acting career soon followed. After brief roles, she landed her breakthrough as Lisa, the tool-time girl, on the hit sitcom Home Improvement. But it was Baywatch that would cement her as a global icon. From 1992 to 1997, Pamela played C.J. Parker, the lifeguard in the iconic red swimsuit, running across the sand in scenes that became some of the most recognized in television history. Baywatch wasn't just a show. It was a worldwide phenomenon, syndicated in over 140 countries. Pamela was suddenly one of the most famous women on the planet, her image plastered on posters, calendars, and tabloids. To millions, she represented fantasy. The blonde hair, the curvaceous figure, the sun-kissed skin. She was a perfect combination of innocence and sensuality. Men adored her, women envied her, and the press followed her every move. But behind that image was still Pamela, the girl from Ladysmith, often overwhelmed by the attention. She later admitted that fame came with pressures she could never have anticipated. Every smile, every outfit, every relationship was scrutinized. People projected their fantasies onto her, often forgetting that she was a real woman with real struggles. What the public didn't see was the toll that objectification and constant surveillance took on her. Pamela was navigating a world where beauty could open doors, but also invited predators and manipulators who saw her as a commodity rather than a human being. She has spoken about how she often felt like she was living in a glass box, admired but not understood, idolized but rarely truly known. Even as she achieved the kind of stardom that few could imagine, she carried a loneliness that fame couldn't cure. By the mid-1990s, Pamela Anderson was the ultimate golden girl of the decade. Her face was everywhere, her name synonymous with glamour, desire, and stardom. But the world she lived in was not the fantasy her fans imagined. She had built a career on beauty and charisma, but beneath the glittering surface was a woman unprepared for how dangerous fame could be. It was in this fragile space, between adoration and isolation, that she met Tommy Lee, the rock star who would change her life forever. Tommy Lee was born Thomas Lee Base on October 3rd, 1962, in Athens, Greece, the son of a U.S. Army sergeant and a Greek mother who had once competed as a beauty contestant. When the family relocated to California, Tommy grew up in a sun-soaked world of suburban Los Angeles, surrounded by the sound of rock and roll, just as the genre was exploding into a new era. He received his first drum kit at age 4, and by his teenage years, his obsession with drumming had become the center of his identity. He dropped out of high school to pursue music, a gamble that would soon turn him into one of the most notorious figures in heavy metal history. By 1981, Tommy had co-founded Mötley Crüe with bassist Nikki Sixx, guitarist Mick Mars, and singer Vince Neil. They quickly became one of the most infamous bands of the decade, known not just for their music, but for their offstage antics. They embodied the phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll more than almost any other group of their time. Tommy, with his tall frame, tattoo-covered body, and charismatic energy behind the drum kit, was central to their wild image. He wasn't just a drummer. He was a spectacle, twirling sticks, incorporating elaborate drum solos, even playing on kits that spun upside down during concerts. To fans, he was untouchable, a rock god who lived by no rules. But with fame came notoriety. Tommy and the rest of Mötley Crüe lived a lifestyle of near-constant indulgence. Their hotel rooms were destroyed after parties that stretched until dawn. Drugs flowed freely, alcohol was a daily habit, and women were a constant presence. They reveled in chaos, and the media loved it. Tabloids chronicled every arrest, every scandal, every outrageous stunt, and Tommy's name was always front and center. By the early 1990s, he was not only a famous musician, but also a symbol of the excesses of rock culture. Tommy's personal life reflected his reputation. He married young, first to Elaine Starchuk and then to actress Heather Locklear in 1986, in what was considered a shocking union between the wild rock drummer and the polished TV star. For a while, their marriage seemed stable, but Tommy's restless nature and constant partying took its toll. By 1993, they divorced, and Tommy fell back into the lifestyle that had always defined him. He dated models, partied harder, and lived with a kind of reckless abandon that made headlines nearly as often as his music. It was against this backdrop that he met Pamela Anderson. On paper, they couldn't have been more different. Pamela was America's golden girl, Playboy's favorite daughter, the wholesome fantasy of a lifeguard running down the beach on Baywatch. Tommy was the inked-up bad boy, a walking storm of energy, drugs, and scandals. Yet their differences were exactly what drew them together. Pamela herself later admitted that she was mesmerized by his energy. He was unpredictable, larger than life, and embodied the kind of danger that felt thrilling to someone who had been thrust into the carefully curated world of Hollywood stardom. For Pamela, who often felt like she was boxed into a polished and controlled image, Tommy represented freedom. He was loud, wild, unapologetic, and lived without caring what anyone thought. There was a rawness to him that contrasted sharply with the artificial perfection of the Hollywood machine she was caught inside. To the outside world, it seemed like a disaster waiting to happen, a glamorous actress and a notorious rock star, but to Pamela, in that moment, it felt intoxicating. Tommy's reputation didn't scare her. If anything, it added to his allure. He had the charisma of a man who had already conquered the world and didn't care about consequences. His tattoos, his wild lifestyle, his constant headlines. These were the traits that made him irresistible, especially to someone like Pamela who, despite her fame, still felt like an outsider. Together, they were opposites in appearance, but mirrors in spirit. Two people searching for something real in a world that was constantly watching and judging them. When they finally collided, it was like gasoline meeting fire. Pamela, the golden girl of the 90s, and Tommy, the bad boy of rock, became an instant obsession for the public. It didn't matter that their worlds seemed incompatible. In each other, they found something they thought was missing. She found rebellion and danger. He found purity and light. That volatile mixture would lead them straight into a love story that would burn bright, then nearly consume them both. It was February of 1995 when their paths finally crossed in a way that would alter the course of both their lives. Pamela Anderson was at the height of her fame, one of the most recognizable faces in the world thanks to Baywatch and her countless magazine covers. Tommy Lee, on the other hand, was a rock star everyone either idolized or feared, still living the hard-partying lifestyle that had made him notorious. Their worlds weren't meant to overlap. Yet when they did, the connection was instant, overwhelming, and unlike anything either of them had ever experienced. The first time they met was at a New Year's Eve party a couple months earlier, where Tommy was immediately captivated by Pamela's presence. She was luminous in the crowd, but at the time, she kept her distance. Pamela was used to men chasing her, but Tommy's persistence would soon set him apart. A few weeks later, determined not to let her slip away, he tracked her down and convinced her to meet with him properly. From there, their story unfolded like something scripted for the tabloids. Tommy was bold, unapologetically forward, and Pamela, used to carefully curated Hollywood encounters, found herself drawn in by his raw, unfiltered energy. When they finally gave into the attraction, it was as if they were swept into a current too strong to resist. Just 4 days after reuniting, Tommy proposed an idea so wild it felt like destiny. They should get married immediately. Pamela, who had never been one for playing by other people's rules, agreed. Together they flew to Cancun, Mexico, and on a sun-drenched beach they said their vows. It wasn't a traditional wedding. Pamela wore a white bikini instead of gown. Tommy was shirtless, and the entire event had the reckless spirit of two people who believed the universe had brought them together. When word of the wedding hit the media, the headlines were explosive. The world was stunned, not just because they had married so quickly, but because of who they were. Pamela Anderson, the ultimate symbol of mainstream beauty and pop culture, marrying Tommy Lee. The tattooed heavy metal drummer with a reputation for chaos seemed unthinkable. The marriage instantly became the subject of global fascination. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others dismissed it as doomed before it began. But to those who saw the photos of Pamela on the beach in her bikini and Tommy grinning beside her, there was no denying the electricity between them. For Pamela, it wasn't just an impulsive decision. She would later describe the connection she felt with Tommy as something beyond logic. The chemistry, she said, was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. It wasn't just physical attraction. though that was undeniable. It was a kind of raw magnetism that made the rest of the world fade away when they were together. In her words, it was like a true love story, one that swept her off her feet before she had time to think of consequences. Tommy echoed her feelings. He often bragged about how quickly and completely they had fallen for each other, calling it fate. To him, Pamela was not just another conquest or a tabloid headline. She was a dream girl made real, the perfect mix of innocence and sexuality. Their whirlwind romance became proof, at least in their eyes, that sometimes love didn't need time to blossom. It simply happened, and when it did, it consumed everything else. The media, of course, couldn't get enough. Every tabloid wanted the story. Every fan wanted to know what this unlikely pair saw in each other. Critics predicted disaster. Yet even their cynicism only fed the fire of fascination. Pamela and Tommy became the new Hollywood obsession, their names linked in bold type across magazines and newspapers around the world. To the outside world, it looked like madness, marriage after just 4 days, with barely a chance to know each other. But to Pamela and Tommy, it felt like destiny. In that moment, under the hot Mexican sun, they weren't thinking about what would come next. They weren't thinking about scandal or stolen tapes or police reports. They weren't imagining courtrooms or heartbreak. They were simply two people caught in the rush of passion, so intense it felt like the only choice was to surrender. It was the beginning of a love story that would captivate and horrify the world in equal measure, a union that would burn bright and fast, leaving behind both unforgettable memories and deep scars. When Pamela and Tommy returned from their whirlwind wedding in Cancun, their lives moved quickly from impulsive romance to building a family. Just a year later, in June 1996, Pamela gave birth to their first son, Brandon Thomas Lee. The following year, in December 1997, their second son, Dylan Jagger Lee, was born. For Pamela, motherhood was transformative. She had lived in a whirlwind of flashing cameras, red carpets, and constant scrutiny for years. But holding her children gave her a new sense of purpose. In her own words, her sons were her greatest accomplishments, grounding her in ways that fame and fortune never could. She was fiercely protective of them, determined to give them love and stability even as her own marriage was beginning to show cracks. Pamela's softer side emerged in those early years as she tried to balance her career with motherhood. She often brought her children on set, even to the beaches of Baywatch, wanting them close rather than hidden away. In interviews, she described the joy of being a mother as something that outshined every professional success she had ever experienced. To fans who had known her only as a glamorous lifeguard or a provocative centerfold, Pamela as a mother revealed another layer. Tender, nurturing, and deeply committed to the well-being of her children. But as much as motherhood steadied Pamela, the turbulence of her relationship with Tommy was never far from the surface. Even during this happy family period, there were signs of volatility. Tommy loved his children, often doting on them and speaking with pride about being a father. Yet his struggles with substance abuse and his unpredictable temper created an unstable environment at home. His rock star lifestyle, built on a foundation of indulgence and rebellion, clashed with the responsibilities of raising a young family. Nights of partying sometimes collided with the needs of his infant sons, leaving Pamela to juggle not just a role of mother, but also caretaker of a husband who was spiraling in and out of control. There was no question that the passion between Pamela and Tommy was real. They adored each other and their children, and there were moments when their home life seemed idyllic. Sunlit afternoons with the boys, playful moments captured by paparazzi lenses, and public appearances with a family radiated a kind of chaotic joy. Yet beneath that surface was an undercurrent of tension that no amount of love could mask. The very intensity that had drawn them together began to work against them. Tommy's jealousy and volatility sometimes boiled over, and Pamela, despite her strength, often found herself walking on eggshells to keep the peace. Those who were close to the couple described their home as a roller coaster, highs filled with affection and playfulness, and lows punctuated by arguments that sometimes turned explosive. For Pamela, the children became her anchor, her reason to endure the storms. She once said that her sons saved her, that they gave her something bigger than herself to live for. She wanted desperately to protect them from the chaos that surrounded their parents' lives. But as the years passed, the weight of Tommy's behavior began to make that dream impossible. Even in the early days of parenthood, the cracks were visible. Tommy's addictions, his impulsive outbursts, and the shadow of fame created instability. At the same time, Pamela's career was still soaring, and the media obsession with her every move meant that nothing remained private for long. What the world saw were the smiling photos and glamorous appearances. What they didn't see was the tension building behind closed doors, the warning signs that passion alone was not enough to sustain a marriage. For Pamela, those years were bittersweet. She experienced the deepest love of her life, not just for Tommy, but for the children they had created together. Yet she also began to sense that the family she had dreamed of, the stability she wanted for Brandon and Dylan, might be slipping away before her eyes. The fiery chemistry that had once felt like destiny was now showing its darker side, and as the 1990s drew to a close, the volatility of their love story was about to erupt into a series of events that would shatter not only their marriage, but also their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. In the mid-1990s, Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee were already one of the most talked-about couples in Hollywood. Their whirlwind romance and high-profile marriage had captivated the public. But in 1995, their private lives were ripped open in a way that no celebrity couple had ever experienced before. It began with something as ordinary as home renovations. They had hired a contractor to work on their Malibu home, a sprawling property where they hoped to build a life together with their children. But disputes arose over payment and access, and the relationship between Tommy and the contractor soured quickly. What happened next would mark the beginning of one of the biggest scandals in pop culture history. Among the belongings in the house was a personal safe. Inside, along with jewelry, guns, and family photos, was a private videotape that Pamela and Tommy had filmed during their honeymoon. It wasn't meant for anyone else's eyes. It was just a collection of intimate moments between a husband and wife, captured at a time when they were deeply in love and carefree. When the contractor, angry and allegedly seeking revenge after being dismissed on the project, managed to steal the safe, he stumbled upon that tape. Instead of returning it or destroying it, he released it into a world that was only just beginning to understand the power of the internet. The leak of the tape spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. At first, it was circulated on VHS bootlegs, passed around like forbidden treasure. Soon, however, the video became one of the first major pieces of celebrity content to go viral on the internet, a new and uncontrollable medium at the time. There were no real safeguards, no digital takedowns, no way to stop millions of strangers from consuming what had once been their most private memory. Almost overnight, Pamela and Tommy became unwilling pioneers in the cruel new world of internet voyeurism. The couple immediately took legal action. They filed lawsuits to stop distribution, and courts briefly ordered companies to cease selling the video. But the damage had already been done. Once the footage hit the internet, there was no stopping it. Every attempt to pull it back only seemed to fuel further interest. The public's appetite was insatiable, and tabloids delighted in covering the scandal from every angle. Instead of sympathy, Pamela and Tommy found themselves mocked, ridiculed, and reduced to a punchline in late-night jokes. For Pamela, the impact was devastating. She later admitted that the theft of the tape destroyed her sense of privacy and safety in ways she would never fully recover from. It wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about violation. Something that had been hers, something that was intimate and sacred, was suddenly in the hands of millions of strangers. She described it as feeling like she had been stripped naked in front of the entire world without her consent. Worse, people often assumed she had released the tape intentionally, capitalizing on her sex symbol image. That assumption cut deeply, because to her it was never a game or a marketing stunt. It was a trauma. For Tommy, the reaction was just as intense, though different. His first instinct was rage. Known for his fiery temper, he lashed out at those around him and publicly declared his fury at the betrayal. He wanted revenge on the man who had stolen their tape, and his anger often turned physical in ways that only added fuel to the press coverage. Yet beneath that rage was helplessness. For all his bluster and bravado, Tommy couldn't stop the spread. No amount of lawsuits, threats, or anger could undo what had been unleashed. The scandal reshaped the couple's public image forever. What had once been a fairy tale of love and passion was now tainted by humiliation and violation. For Pamela, it haunted her career. No matter how many acting roles she pursued, no matter how much she wanted to be seen as a serious actress or activist, the tape followed her like a shadow. Every interview seemed to circle back to it. Every headline reduced her identity to the scandal. Tommy, too, carried the weight, but as a rock star with a history of bad behavior, the public seemed less sympathetic to Pamela's suffering than fascinated by his rage. In hindsight, the stolen tape scandal was more than just tabloid fodder. It was the beginning of a new era, one where celebrity privacy would become increasingly impossible to protect. Pamela and Tommy were the first to pay the price in the digital age, their marriage and reputation shaken by something they never consented to share. For Pamela especially, it was a wound that lingered for decades. She would later say that the tape felt like a theft of her soul, something she could never take back. And though Tommy tried to bury the anger, the sense of violation followed them both, adding another crack to a marriage already under strain. By the late 1990s, the shine had worn off Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee's storybook image. What had once looked like a glamorous, wild romance was, behind closed doors, turning into something darker and more dangerous. The fiery chemistry that drew them together, the impulsiveness, the passion, the volatility, now often erupted in fights, jealousy, and violence. Their home life was increasingly unstable, with Tommy's temper and substance abuse clashing against Pamela's desire to create a safe and nurturing environment for their two young sons, Brandon and Dylan. Pamela had always described Tommy as the great love of her life, and despite the turbulence, she had tried to hold their family together. But the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Tommy's anger could spiral quickly, and arguments often escalated. For Pamela, who was trying to protect not only herself but also her children, the marriage became more about survival than romance. The breaking point came in February 1998. During a particularly heated argument at their Malibu home, Tommy assaulted Pamela while she was holding their infant son. Afraid and desperate, she called the police. When officers arrived, the truth of what was happening behind their closed doors was undeniable. Tommy was arrested and charged with felony spousal abuse. The story shocked the public. For years, their relationship had been painted as a mix of chaos and passion, but now the headlines revealed something darker. Pamela Anderson, the most famous woman in the world, was living in fear of her husband. The case played out in court, and Tommy eventually pleaded no contest. He was sentenced to 6 months in Los Angeles County Jail. For a man who had built his image on being a rebellious rock star, the sentence was a sobering moment. Yet for Pamela, the pain went far beyond public scandal. It was a shattering of her marriage. The realization that the love she once believed would last forever had turned into something that endangered her family. During his sentencing, Pamela spoke openly about what had happened. She described living in fear of Tommy's volatility, explaining that she wanted to protect her sons from growing up in a violent home. Her words were not only a plea to court, but also a declaration that she could no longer endure the cycle of abuse. Filing for divorce was not just about ending a marriage. It was about reclaiming her life and safeguarding her children. Tommy served 4 months of his sentence before being released, but by then the marriage was over. Pamela moved forward with a divorce, taking on the role of single mother while navigating her career under the constant glare of the public eye. The fallout was brutal, with tabloids feasting on the story, but Pamela remained firm in her decision. Love, no matter how deep, could not survive violence. Looking back years later, Pamela would still describe Tommy as the love of her life, but she never wavered in acknowledging the pain and danger that defined their marriage's end. It was a story of passion that burned too hot, a love that crossed the line into destruction. And while Tommy later admitted regret for his actions, the damage had already been done. The woman who had once rushed into marriage after only 4 days now had to stand on her own, carrying both the scars of her relationship and the strength that came from surviving it. The 1998 arrest and jail sentence became a turning point in their story. Not just in a marriage, but the moment when the myth of their perfect, rebellious love was shattered completely. What remained was the undeniable truth. No matter how intoxicating love may feel, it cannot excuse violence. And for Pamela, choosing her children's safety over the chaos of her marriage was the hardest but most necessary decision of her life. When Pamela Anderson officially filed for divorce in 1998, it was not just the end of her marriage. It was the end of the dream she had once believed in so fiercely. The divorce papers came only weeks after Tommy Lee was sentenced to jail for spousal abuse. And for Pamela, the choice was painfully clear. She had to protect her children. Though the media focused on the scandal, inside her Malibu home the decision was rooted in survival. She was no longer just a glamorous starlet or the sex symbol plastered on magazine covers. She was a mother determined to shield Brandon and Dylan from the violence that had defined their early years. The divorce was finalized later that year, and Pamela stepped into life as a single mother. She carried the responsibility of raising two young boys largely on her own while continuing her career under a spotlight that rarely dimmed. For all the chaos surrounding her, her role as a mother became her anchor. She often spoke of Brandon and Dylan as her greatest joy, her purpose, the reason she found strength even in the darkest moments. She created a world for them that was as stable as possible, knowing full well that the world outside was anything but forgiving. Yet, Tommy Lee never disappeared from their lives entirely. Despite the violence and the breakdown of their marriage, he remained their father, and the boys loved him. This meant that Pamela and Tommy's lives would stay entangled long after their divorce was finalized. Custody disputes became a recurring part of their story. Courts, lawyers, and negotiations often decided when and how Tommy would see his children. At times, the disagreements grew bitter, fueled by resentment, mistrust, and old wounds that had never truly healed. For Pamela, the challenge was in balancing her children's need for their father with her instinct to protect them from the volatility that had marked their marriage. Co-parenting was not easy. Pamela admitted in later interviews that she struggled with the arrangement, that every encounter with Tommy carried the weight of their history. There were moments of civility, even attempts at reconciliation, but they rarely lasted. The trust between them was broken, and once that trust was gone, it could not be fully restored. Still, for the sake of their children, they tried, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, but always bound together by the two boys who were innocent of the turmoil that surrounded them. There were periods when Pamela allowed Tommy back into her life, not just as a co-parent, but as a partner, fueled by the lingering bond she had always felt for him. She never denied that he was the love of her life, and in weaker moments, that love tempted her toward reconciliation. But reality always intervened. The old patterns resurfaced, the volatility returned, and she would remind herself of why she had left in the first place. Love alone was not enough, not when it came at the expense of safety and peace of mind. As the years passed, their sons grew into young men, and Pamela often spoke about how much she cherished her role as their mother. Brandon and Dylan were her priority, her focus, and the greatest source of pride in her life. Even as her career ebbed and flowed, even as the press continued to remind her of her past, Pamela stayed grounded in motherhood. She knew that whatever chaos had defined her marriage, her legacy would not be scandal. It would be the children she raised with love, resilience, and determination. The divorce may have ended Pamela and Tommy's marriage, but it did not sever their connection. Through custody battles, courtrooms, and co-parenting struggles, their lives remained bound together for years. For Pamela, it was a constant reminder of the painful truth she had already learned, that sometimes love is not enough to hold two people together, especially when trust has been shattered. She carried on not because she wanted to, but because she had to, for Brandon, for Dylan, and for the life she refused to let slip into the chaos of the past. After her divorce from Tommy Lee in 1998, Pamela Anderson tried to move forward, but the shadow of their marriage lingered over everything. She had been the golden girl of the 90s, a household name thanks to Baywatch and countless magazine covers, but her personal life remained under the glare of tabloid headlines. Pamela remarried several times, each relationship making news, each one ending in disappointment, and each one inevitably compared to the stormy love she had once shared with Tommy. In 2006, Pamela married rock star Kid Rock after a long and highly publicized on-again, off-again romance. Their relationship seemed like another wild pairing of music and celebrity, but it collapsed almost as quickly as it began. Within a year, Pamela filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The split turned messy when Kid Rock made harsh public comments about Pamela, particularly mocking her past with Tommy and the infamous tape. something that had haunted her for years. Not long after, Pamela's personal life took another twist when she married professional poker player Rick Salomon in 2007. That marriage was annulled after just a few months, but Pamela would marry him again years later, in 2014. This second attempt at love with Rick also ended in divorce, and once again Pamela found herself in headlines that focused less on her career and more on her turbulent relationships. In 2020, Pamela made news yet again when she married her bodyguard Dan Hayhurst in a private ceremony at her Vancouver Island home in Canada. It seemed like a new chapter, more grounded and away from Hollywood chaos. But even that union fell apart within a year, ending in separation by early 2022. Through all of these marriages, Pamela often admitted in interviews that none of her husbands truly measured up to Tommy. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how much pain their relationship had caused, she continued to describe him as the love of her life. In her 2023 memoir and documentary, she confessed that she had never loved anyone the way she loved Tommy, and that in her heart, she doubted she ever would again. It was a bittersweet truth. He had hurt her deeply, but he had also been the one person who had captured her completely. Tommy Lee, for his part, also moved on publicly. After his release from jail and his divorce from Pamela, he continued to live up to his rock star image, dating actresses, models, and reality TV stars. He was linked to women like Maite Garcia, the former wife of Prince, and later reality star Mae Anderson. In 2019, he married social media personality and singer Brittany Ferland, who was decades younger than him. Their relationship became another subject of tabloid fascination, especially given how publicly affectionate they were on platforms like Instagram. Despite their separate paths, Pamela and Tommy could never fully escape one another in the eyes of the public. Whenever Pamela remarried, questions about Tommy resurfaced. Whenever Tommy appeared in the press, Pamela's name was never far behind. Even their children, Brandon and Dylan, grew up with constant reminders that their parents' love story was one of the most infamous in pop culture history. Over time, both Pamela and Tommy softened in how they spoke about one another. Though their marriage ended in violence, scandal, and heartbreak, neither denied the intensity of what they had once shared. Pamela, especially, became candid in admitting that Tommy remained the great love of her life, even if he was also her greatest source of pain. Tommy, too, acknowledged that their marriage had been chaotic and destructive, but he often spoke with pride about the family they had created together. Life after Tommy did not bring Pamela the fairy tale ending she once hoped for, nor did it bring Tommy the redemption of a new perfect marriage. What it brought was separation, new partners, fresh heartbreaks, and continued scrutiny. But beneath it all, the truth remained. Though they lived apart, though they remarried, though decades passed, the story of Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee was never truly over. They had become inseparable in the cultural imagination. Two people whose names would forever be linked, whether they wanted them to be or not. By the time Pamela Anderson turned 58, she had lived through more than most people could imagine. Fairy tale fame, a marriage that burned too bright, global scandal, heartbreak, and survival. In 2023, she chose to tell her story in her own words. With the release of her memoir Love, Pamela, and the Netflix documentary Pamela, A Love Story, the world finally heard her voice unfiltered, without the tabloids' gossip or speculation shaping the narrative. For the first time, Pamela reflected on her life with a rare honesty that revealed both strength and vulnerability. In the book and the documentary, Pamela described her marriage to Tommy Lee in a way only she could, with both tenderness and pain. She called it romantic and wild, a love affair that swept her off her feet and defined much of her life. She admitted that the chemistry between them was unlike anything she had ever experienced. "He was the love of my life," she confessed, her words carrying the weight of truth after decades of silence. But she also called it a nightmare, acknowledging that the very passion that bound them together was also what tore them apart. Their love, she admitted, was intoxicating but ultimately toxic, something too volatile to last, no matter how much they cared for each other. One of the deepest wounds she revisited was the infamous stolen tape. Decades later, she still described it as a trauma she never fully recovered from. She said it was not simply embarrassing. It was a violation of the most personal kind, a theft of something sacred between her and her husband. Pamela spoke of the shame, the mockery, and the way the scandal overshadowed her career. Even years later, she struggled with the fact that people often assumed she had been complicit in its release, when in reality it had left her devastated and powerless. In her words, it was not just a tape, it was a piece of her soul stolen and spread across the world. Her reflections on Tommy were equally complex. She admitted that she never loved anyone the way she loved him, even through all the chaos. But she was also clear-eyed. That love was destructive. It was impossible to continue, she explained, acknowledging that passion alone cannot sustain a family when violence and mistrust are present. Time had given her clarity, and while the love never vanished, the truth of its consequences could not be denied. Today, their lives look very different. Tommy Lee is married to Brittany Ferlin, a social media personality who's brought a quieter, steadier rhythm to his life. He is still the rock star at heart, but the wild chaos of his Mötley Crüe years has softened with age. For Pamela, the choice has been different. She has chosen solitude and peace in her home on Vancouver Island, Canada, where she gardens, writes, and devotes herself to activism. She has become more private, focusing on animal rights causes, environmental work, and, most importantly, her sons, Brandon and Dylan, now grown, remain the center of her world, and she has spoken with pride about the men they have become. Her documentary closes not on scandal, but on stillness. Pamela walks the shores of the island where she now lives, her hair undone, no makeup, no pretense. The woman who was once the most photographed in the world is finally comfortable in her own skin. She has chosen to tell her truth, unflinching, vulnerable, and unapologetic. She admits her regrets, honors her joys, and accepts that her love story with Tommy Lee will forever define a part of her. But instead of letting it consume her, she has reclaimed it as part of her journey. For Pamela, healing has not meant forgetting. It has meant acknowledging that her life was both a dream and a nightmare, and that both shaped who she is today. She no longer runs from her past, but she no longer lives in it either. Instead, she has found strength in solitude, peace in her activism, and love in motherhood. The Hollywood whirlwind is behind her. At 58, Pamela Anderson finally speaks with clarity, and her voice is louder, truer, and freer than it has ever been. Their love story has become one of Hollywood's most infamous legends, a cautionary tale wrapped in glamour, scandal, and heartbreak. Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee were never just another celebrity couple. They were the headline makers, the obsession of tabloids, the whirlwind romance that seemed too explosive to last. And it didn't. What began as passion at first sight turned into a marriage defined as much by desire as by destruction. For years, their names were inseparable, and not just because of their children. They were bound by a stolen tape that redefined how the world viewed celebrity privacy. In many ways, Pamela and Tommy were the first to be victimized by the internet age, when their most intimate moment was stolen and consumed by millions. That scandal changed the landscape forever, paving the way for a culture where private lives became public entertainment without consent. They paid the price in humiliation, legal battles, and lost peace of mind. Pamela, especially, carried the weight of being reduced to a caricature of a scandal she never chose. But even without the tape, their marriage would have been remembered. The volatility, the police calls, the jail sentence, the divorce. It was all out in the open, unfolding under relentless scrutiny. Yet, what made their story unforgettable wasn't just the scandal or the violence. It was the undeniable force of the love that held them together, however briefly. They were magnetic to each other, unable to resist, even when it hurt. Their passion was as iconic as it was tragic. A reminder that love at its most intoxicating can also be love at its most destructive. Pamela herself summed it up best, reflecting in her memoir and her documentary decades later. She admitted that her marriage to Tommy Lee was both the happiest and the worst time of her life. She called it romantic and wild, but also a nightmare she could not escape. To her, Tommy would always be the love of her life, the one man she never truly let go of. And yet, she also knew that what they had was impossible to sustain. The same fire that brought them together was a fire that eventually burned everything down. Today, their lives have diverged. Tommy is remarried, settling into a quieter chapter, while Pamela has chosen solitude on Vancouver Island, far from Hollywood's chaos. They no longer live in each other's worlds, but their legacy remains intertwined. Theirs is a story that people cannot stop revisiting, not because it was perfect, but because it was raw, messy, and human. It exposed the fragility of love when fame, addiction, and violence are added to the mix. At 58, Pamela Anderson no longer hides from the truth. She speaks openly, no longer bound by shame, no longer silenced by scandal. Her marriage to Tommy Lee was her great love, but also her great nightmare. It gave her sons, her deepest passion, and her deepest scars. It made her who she is today, a woman who has survived the extremes of love and loss, fame and violation, and who finally stands on her own with clarity and peace. The legacy of Pamela and Tommy is not just tabloid fodder. It is a reflection of how love can be both beautiful and brutal. Their story lives on because it reminds us of something timeless. That passion without balance can destroy, that fame without privacy can wound, and that sometimes the greatest love stories are also the most tragic.